Hey, as great as your camera may be, it's still very limited in its ability to obtain great exposures, especially in trying conditions. So I'm going to show you how to take control of your camera's exposure and get those great photos that you're after. Hi, I'm Norm Hamilton. I'm here to help improve the quality and control of your photography. My intent is to explain things simply without all the technical aspects and get you on your way to creating your photographic art. I'm making a series of videos to show you how to take complete control of the exposure, the depth of field, and control of motion simply by learning to use the manual settings. So the first thing to do is to turn that dial away from auto and program and put it on manual. So look, it's not as complicated as you might think. So are you ready? Let's start with exposure. There's 3 adjustment parameters that control the exposure: shutter speed, f-stop, that's the aperture size in the lens, and ISO. Shutter speed, well, the slower shutter speeds allow more exposure, and of course faster shutter speeds would give you less exposure. The f-stop, again, that's the size of the aperture in the lens. The smaller the aperture, the less exposure. The larger the aperture, the more exposure. Now ISO, or ISO, is the sensitivity of the sensor to light. Lower ISO means less exposure. Higher ISO gives you more exposure. So how does this work? Well, let's look at the exposure triangle. Now, as you can see in this graphic, it's the relationship between shutter speed, f-stop, and ISO that creates your ideal exposure. You can adjust all 3 to obtain the exposure that you're looking for, and once you've reached that, you can maintain it even if you change one side of the triangle, simply by adjusting one of the other sides in the opposite directions. And we'll cover the reasons you might want to change any or all of the parameters in future videos, so come back often to catch those as they're posted. On each of the parameters, the amount of light changes by 1 stop for each full setting. So full setting is shown in these shutter speed and f-stop and ISO sequences. The standard shutter speed sequence is like 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/15, up to 1/1000th, and beyond. The f-stop sequence, with the largest opening to the smallest, 1.4, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, and so on. Now in f-stop, the larger number equals a smaller aperture. So f2, the lens is almost completely wide open, and f22, the lens is almost completely closed. It's a very small opening. The ISO standard sequence runs usually like 100, 200, 400, 800, and so on. And remember that the higher ISO may cause unwanted noise or color shifts. 100 ISO is less exposure, and the higher numbers give more exposure, but may bring unwanted noise or color shifts. So change the ISO only if you have to. So how do these work together? Well, let's assume that your desired exposure settings are a shutter speed of 1/15th, aperture of f8, and an ISO of 400. If you change the shutter speed to 1/30th of a second, thus creating less exposure, the image will go darker. So to correct your exposure, you can adjust the f-stop to f5.6, or you could have increased the ISO to 800 instead. So let's have a quick review. Shutter speed, remember slower shutter speeds equal more exposure, faster shutter speeds equal less exposure. The aperture, Smaller equals less exposure, larger equals more exposure. And again, remember, the smaller numbers are larger openings, the higher numbers are smaller openings. The ISO, slower ISO equals less exposure, faster ISO equals more exposure. So on the triangle, it kind of looks like this. If you change the shutter speed, then you have to alter the f-stop or the ISO. So here's how it looks on the LCD screen. We begin with a shutter speed of 1/15 and an aperture of f8 with an ISO of 400. If we change the shutter speed from 1/15 to 1/30, we get less exposure and the image goes darker. So we can correct that either by opening the aperture stop to f5.6, so one stop wider than f8, and going back to that original exposure. Or if we didn't want to do that, we wanted to keep the original f-stop, we could have raised the ISO to 800 in order to achieve the same exposure. Well, I hope this video helps you understand the relationship between shutter speed, f-stop, and ISO in obtaining the exposure that you want. So next up is a video titled Depth of Field, your creative tool. In it, I'll show you how to use the aperture setting to control the depth of field and separate your subject from the background, or use it to ensure that as much of your image as possible is in sharp focus. So come back often for more photography tips. If you like this video, tap the thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and turn on notifications by ringing the bell. And I'll see you in the next video. Until then, have a great day.